Good evening. Ken Mallory and I want to welcome you to our final Lowell Lecture Series, sponsored by the Lowell Institute. This series that we've had, Jeremy is our last speaker, on science and values, complements our new Living Links exhibit, Choices for Survival, which I hope you will or have gone to see. I hope you've enjoyed this series. We'll be having a second series next year on the power of one and many, which will showcase individual and collective actions and how you can make a difference. Stay tuned. Tonight, this series is being taped by several programs. First of all, the aquarium is involved in a new partnership with WGBH. Tonight's lecture is being taped for WGBH from Network, our forum. It's a Network Forum webcast. In about a week, the lecture can be seen online at www.wgbh.org/forum. And it's also being recorded for WMFO at Tufts and TV3 in Medford. Our tonight's speaker is Jeremy Jackson. Jeremy is the William and Mary B. Ritter Professor of Oceanography and Director of Geosciences Division at Scripps Institution of Oceanography, and a senior scientist at the Smithsonian Tropical Research Institute in Panama. He was professor of ecology at the Johns Hopkins University from 1971 to 1985. Jeremy is the author of more than 100 scientific publications and 5 books. His current research includes the long-term ecological consequences of historical overfishing on coastal ecosystems. He's also worked extensively on the ecology of coral reef communities and the tempo and mode of speciation in the sea. Dr. Jackson is a fellow of the American Academy of Arts and Sciences and received the Secretary's Gold Medal for Exceptional Service of the Smithsonian Institution in 1997. His work on overfishing was chosen by Discover magazine as the outstanding discovery of 2001. Jeremy's talk tonight is titled Unnatural Oceans, Historical Overfishing and the Collapse of Coastal Marine Ecosystems. At the end of his talk tonight, he's going to show a 7-minute video, so don't get up after his talk. Will you please join me in welcoming Jeremy Jackson?
Thank you very much. This is the first time, actually, I've ever been to the New England Aquarium. I think aquariums and zoos are really interesting places because I'm looking out on at least half of this audience and thinking of what we thought of zoos being when we went to them as children. Zoos were places that brought the wild to us. They gave us a glimpse of life that we wouldn't otherwise see. But now, for younger people, zoos have become a place where we package up rare, precious remnants of wildlife and try and keep them going because somehow or another their environment has deteriorated. I'm sure when this aquarium was built, it was built with the notion that it was bringing a sense of the wonder of the oceans to people here in Boston. And I just wonder how long it's going to be before this aquarium, like zoos, will end up in the business of keeping the last 2 or 10 or 20 or 100 living species X, Y, or Z. We're going through a transition in the world which is quite remarkable. The oceans are changing at a rate so fast that we don't really understand. And I believe, and what this talk is about, that we really have about 10 years in this bottleneck. And what we do in this 10 years is going to determine what the oceans are going to be like for our children and our grandchildren and people afterwards. If you think that's an exaggeration, think about this. A book about a fish. A book about a fish is a pretty silly thing. Who would ever read a book about a fish? Who's going to play the fish in the movie? Cod did change the world. It changed the world for centuries. And like the passenger pigeon, we have managed to eliminate it for all practical purposes. Now, one of the things that's really funny about this book cover is that those 3 guys on the bottom think that they have big fish, and they're very happy about it. But if you go back and look at historical records, you find that the codfish that were taken in the beginning of the fishery were the size of the people who were catching them. And in case you think that that's artistic license, this is a graph of the average size of codfish consumed in the Gulf of Maine for 5,000 years. The first 5 data points come from archaeological sites. The remainder come from fisheries data. You can see very clearly that the average size codfish that was eaten was a meter long. And then there's that vertical decline, that sudden drop-off in size. And at that next to the last point, I forgot to ask for a pointer. If anybody has a pointer, that would be great. At that next to the last point, that circle that's one above the last, government said it was still all right to fish codfish. So if they had bothered to look at what we know about 5,000 years, perhaps even governments would have been wise enough to say that it was time to stop fishing cod. Now, this is an old story. It's the story of shifting baselines. And if doctors practiced medicine the way environmental scientists practice environmental protection, I'll survive without it. They would be kicked out for malpractice. Imagine a woman with a rare disease who's away on travel, and she collapses and she's rushed to the hospital. But the doctors in this strange place know nothing of her past. Without her medical history, the chances of an incorrect diagnosis are great, and the chances of her survival are much less than it would have been if she were at home. In the same way, if we don't know an environment's history, and we try to treat the problems of an environment today, and we ignore the case history of that environment, then we can just as easily misdiagnose the cause of its problems, but there's no malpractice suits to be brought against us as environmentalists. All of this is an example of what Daniel Pauly called the shifting baseline syndrome. You all know what that is. Natural is the way the world was when you first saw it when you were a kid. Unnatural is all the horrible stuff that happened to it since, which is why old people are more depressing than young people. I'm going to talk about shifting baselines and historical effects in terms of fishing, which I believe is the first and biggest environmental impact on the oceans. I could be talking about lots of other stuff. And basically this graph, which shows that cod used to be sea monsters in great abundance until they became a foot long, is a story that is repeated over and over again in the oceans. And we don't realize it because our science began after these changes had already happened. To make that concrete for you, I've been very lucky in my career to work in places that have great libraries. At Scripps Institution of Oceanography, we pride ourselves as having one of the 2 greatest oceanographic libraries in the world. If you took all the books in that library that were published before 1900, you could comfortably put them in a small closet. Almost everything we know about the natural world is from the 20th century on. In fact, 80 to 90% of what we know about the oceans was published since the Second World War. But the Industrial Revolution began long before that. Intensive fishing began long before that. And so our sense of what is natural is fundamentally distorted by the fact that scientists began doing what they do after most of the changes that I'm going to talk about had already taken place. So basically my pitch is this, that history is fundamentally important in understanding what's wrong with the oceans and trying to fix them. And fishing is particularly important in the historical sense because when we go out and hunt and gather marine organisms, which is what fishing is, of course, a rather primitive economy, we do a lot more than decrease the abundance of fish because big fish eat little fish, if you remember the wonderful Bruegel painting. All of this happened a long time ago. There is no place on Earth where we can study natural marine ecosystems intact to have as a control. And so we have to use historical information in order to get there. So I want to start by talking about estuaries, and usually I name Chesapeake Bay or Pamlico Sound, but right out there, wherever the water is out there, is another good example. And what you have here is a before and after, a then and now food web of what estuaries like the Chesapeake Bay used to look like. And you just look at those top predators: toothed whales, baleen whales, sharks, seals, alligators, crocodiles, all in Chesapeake Bay. And then the now food webs, and when in all of these comparisons of then and now, the now food webs look like Zeus on the top of Mount Olympus with the lightning bolts coming down on whatever it is we're taking, and the then food webs looked like Darwin's Tangled Bank. That's sort of a scientific way of showing it. This is the way I like to show it. That's John White's painting of Pamlico Sound from the 17th century. There's hammerhead sharks, sturgeons. The first great fishery of Chesapeake Bay and Pamlico Sound was sturgeons that were bigger than I am tall. And it was a caviar fishery sent back to Britain. So what happened in Chesapeake Bay? If you go to the bay and you take a pipe and you push it into the bottom and you get a core, and then you bring that back to the lab and you look at the layers in the core like the pages in a book, you can read those layers of sediment and reconstruct the history. And a woman named Grace Brush did that a long time ago in Chesapeake Bay, and this is a cartoon representation of one of her more dramatic results, and you can see that something big happened in organic carbon in 1730, more or less, and it's no surprise that what it was that happened was tobacco, corn, and cotton, agriculture, and the cutting down of forests. And it's the awareness of this that makes us think that the problem in places like Chesapeake Bay or Boston Harbor or anywhere like that is largely one of pollution, input from the land. Now, if we look at other things, we have land cleared there on the left, sedimentation rate, allergies, ragweed. You wouldn't have gotten allergies in Washington, D.C. before 1730. But then here on the right, there's this strange thing about diatoms, floating diatoms. You know, the problem in estuaries, the term eutrophication, which describes the buildup of organic material from huge populations of plankton, loss of oxygen because of all this organic matter accumulating. That process of eutrophication is what we're trying to do something about in places like Chesapeake Bay, and free-floating diatoms can be used in cores as an index of this process of deterioration, buildup of organic material, and loss of oxygen. And you see that the problem is that the big increase in these in this abundance of the free-floating forms happens long after the clearance of the land, more than 100 years after. And so why is there this delay? Well, Chesapeake Bay used to be packed with oysters. This is a map of the approach to Tangier Sound in the 1830s, taken off of a chart. And all those dark patterns with the dots in the center are the oyster reefs that broke the water at low tide that made it extremely difficult to sail into Tangier Sound through that channel where all those dots were. Oysters were a hazard to navigation. They're all over the charts of Chesapeake Bay, but they're not there now at all. And we can see it dramatically in this picture. All around the bay, mountains of oyster shells that used to be there and that aren't there anymore. Now, oysters used to filter the volume of Chesapeake Bay every 3 days. So think about that. That entire volume of water, bigger than the state of New Jersey, to some average depth, and oysters, which more or less invented what we call the millipore filter in science, that can take cruddy water and turn it into something clean, did that job of filtration extraordinarily effectively. We fished the oysters out in a period of about 50 years once we had high power. And the graphs on the left show in Maryland, for example, the decline of oyster landings. North Carolina, South Carolina, Georgia, it's all the same story. This incredible decline in oysters. And in the right, you see the modern rise of inputs of fertilizer, which is what people think is the cause of the problem of this, the process of eutrophication in Chesapeake Bay. But it lags far behind the process of removal of the oysters. And we can see that in this simple little graph, where the x's, the small x's on the left, represent the initial cutting down of forest and simple fertilizers in fields. The squares represent different measures of overfishing of oysters. The triangles represent the catastrophe of eutrophication, the loss of oxygen, the buildup of organic matter, the fish kills, and all the rest. And the big X's that come afterwards in time represent the modern usage of fertilizer. So clearly the eutrophication is a process that preceded the input of those nutrients, and yet virtually all of the literally billions of dollars that we spend on trying to fix Chesapeake Bay is spent on the problem of nutrient addition. So if we were doctors, we could look at Chesapeake Bay and say there was an original diagnosis which said the problem in this environment was due to all of this input of pollution and nutrients. But if we use historical insight, we can see that there's a disconnect between the timing of the input of the abundant nutrients and the problem of the degradation of the environment. And that degradation follows closely on the overfishing of the oysters. So our re-diagnosis of the health of Chesapeake Bay would be to say, if we want to fix this environment, then we need to figure out how to bring back the populations of oysters, or we're going to fail. We're going to continue to fail. And in fact, we have succeeded in reducing the nutrient input to Chesapeake Bay, but we have not fixed Chesapeake Bay. It's worse than ever before. Okay, so from the cheeriness of near home, we can go south to the Caribbean and talk about my favorite subject, which is turtles. Green turtles that were used to make green turtle soup were extraordinarily abundant in the Caribbean. This is a food web of coral reefs and seagrass beds in the tropics, then and now, with all the sharks and big birds and seals, which are now extinct in the Caribbean, and the huge saltwater crocodiles and whatever, and nowadays a very much simplified food web. And green turtles were sea turtles, shown there on the left, were a big part of tropical food webs and are extremely rare now. Now, these are some historical descriptions of the abundance of sea turtles, of green turtles, one species, in the Caribbean in just after 1492. Columbus, on his second voyage, felt that his ships were running aground on the backs of the turtles and that they could not make their way through them. Columbus's son, in 1503, making his way back from Panama on the fourth and last voyage, described the Cayman Islands as looking like a field littered with stones that were the backs of the turtles. And my favorite, from Edward Long, it is affirmed that vessels that have lost their latitude in hazy weather have steered entirely by the noise made by all these animals. Now, when the British stole Jamaica from the Spanish to turn it into a sugar factory, the engine of the sugar factory was West African people. And because of genocide, there were only 5,000 people left in Jamaica when the British stole it, and there was no agricultural base. And so what they fed those people with was turtles. And because those turtles were so valuable, and because Jamaica at the time was worth more than all of Canada, there were very careful records kept. And I found those records, and I was able to determine that for a period of something like 100 years, they took a minimum of 13,000 of these animals that weighed 500 pounds apiece and brought them back. So with that kind of information, I made these back-of-the-envelope calculations and came up with estimates which are considered at this point actually to be conservative, of something like 45 million several hundred-pound animals of one species in the Caribbean in 1492. Now, to scale that for you, the biomass of that is greater than that of all the large animals in East Africa. That's a very large number of turtles. And if you don't believe my calculations, maybe you'll believe Lewis Carroll. You all remember Alice in Wonderland, and you remember the mock turtle. And Alice asked the Red Queen, "What's the red turtle?" And the Queen said, "Everybody knows what the mock turtle is. The mock turtle is what you make mock turtle soup from." Mock turtle soup, of course, is what you made when you didn't have a real turtle and you had to satisfy your guests. And if you look at Lewis Carroll's mock turtle, it's got calf's feet and a calf's head. And Alice in Wonderland was written during the American Civil War. And already by that time, this extraordinary fishery had totally collapsed. Okay, so we can ask, what did all those turtles do? Among other things, try and imagine the defecation of 45 million 500-pound turtles. Sea cows, dugongs in Australia, it's been described, entire shorelines covered in foot-high piles of dugong excrement for hundreds of kilometers. So it presumably was impressive. Now, turtles, strangely enough, eat turtle grass. They live in turtle grass beds. I did my dissertation on the ecology of turtle grass beds in the Caribbean, and I never saw a green turtle in a turtle grass bed in the 5 years I did my thesis. Turtle grass beds today are knee-high. The tips of the blades rot. They break off. They're very grungy. They're fouled by all kinds of organisms, bacteria and fungi and all sorts of other things. But we have reports from the 17th century that says turtle grass blades are 4 to 6 inches long. They looked like putting greens because, strangely enough, the turtles ate the turtle grass, and they did the same thing to the turtle grass beds that cattle do to pasture, especially when they are overgrazing. Turtles also had the bacteria in their stomachs which allowed them to metabolize the cellulose of those plants in the same way that cattle chew their cud and can eat grass in ways that we can't do. None of the other species that are left in the Caribbean, except the manatee, which is on its way out, can do that. And so all the fishes and the sea urchins and whatever that eat turtle grass are only able to eat the sugar, and all the rest of it falls on the ground and rots. And so we have something like 30 times more organic crud in the sediments than we used to have. And also, we have this problem of turtle grass disease. In Florida Bay, turtle grass disease has wiped out these huge pastures of turtle grass. And what's causing this? Well, whenever we don't know what's going on, we say, well, it must be due to climate change, or it's due to pollution, or it's due to runoff. And we spend a lot of money because we really care, because the amateur fishermen, who are an extremely powerful group in this country, really like to go fishing there. And shrimp go through an important part of their life cycle there. And so we've spent a lot of money to try and understand this problem of turtle grass disease. But at no point has anybody asked, well, maybe the turtles were important to the disease. So we can go and we can look now at the problem of turtle grass disease and these beds and all the rest of it, and we can see the previous diagnosis about pollution and anoxia and all the things that we are told to worry about and we should worry about, but which aren't the whole story. And then we have all these historical insights. And so we can then make a re-diagnosis. We can say, if we wanted to solve the problem of turtle grass wasting disease, maybe we need turtles. And so we made a prediction. We said, we predict that the fungus, the slime mold, that causes this wasting disease will colonize the rotten tips of the blades, which didn't used to be there when there were abundant turtles, and that's exactly where it does. In all the descriptions that have ever been done of the slime mold and how it colonizes the plant and all the rest of it, it colonizes a part of the plant that was not there when there were abundant turtles. So if we want to restore those turtle grass beds, we need turtles. And you would think that that would be something we'd like to do, because in fact green turtles are an endangered species and we're supposed to care about it, and we are losing that battle. As I'm sure you're aware, green turtles are declining in abundance at an alarming rate. We are not being successful in doing that. Okay, so very quickly I want to go on to the third environmental system that's important in this story, and that's coral reefs. And that picture is what a coral reef in Jamaica looked like when I went to Jamaica in 1968 for the first time, and I thought I was in paradise. It never occurred to me that the biggest fish that I was seeing were 6 inches long. In that picture there are several fish. There's a little black damselfish swimming on the coral here. I'm going to have to move. Carpet the bottom of coral reefs throughout the Caribbean. That little fish is the three-spot damselfish. Some of you may remember, or you know, Les Kaufman, who did his thesis on the three-spot damselfish, and that was the most common and abundant fish to study in that ecosystem. And it never really occurred to us just how wrong the situation was. The coral was very abundant. The live coral was 70%. Discovery Bay, Jamaica was the holy grail of coral reef ecology. People came from all over the world to study these coral reefs because they were such wonderful, beautiful coral reefs with 70% coral cover, and we had no idea that the whole system had been reduced to the point that it was dependent on the abundance of that one black sea urchin, and that sea urchin died. And within a few years, what happened, if you can understand these graphs, when I learn PowerPoint, I'll learn how to have the little arrows and pointing things and everything. I'm an overhead person, so you'll have to bear with me. But what those graphs show is the diagonal line bars show the abundance of live coral around Jamaica before the death of this sea urchin, and it averages between 50 and 60% live coral cover. And the black bars show the abundance of live coral a few years later, and it averages in this graph around 5% cover, and it's now less than 1% cover. You can see this very powerfully in terms of cause and effect in this graph, which plots the abundance of seaweed versus living coral. And in the 1970s, in those solid dark circles, you can see that live coral cover was very high, and seaweed cover was extremely low. In the 1990s, seaweed cover was between 80 and 100%, and live coral cover was only a few percent. And this is what's happened all over most of the Caribbean. And the story is very simple. The sea urchin was the last living lawnmower in Caribbean coral reefs. Coral reefs are like the story of the Three Little Pigs. Corals build their house of bricks, and seaweed builds their house of straw. And in the presence of parrotfish and all the other very powerful grazing organisms that can eat things like cement that has living material inside of it, having the house of bricks is a great advantage. But as soon as you remove the grazing organisms, the fish and the sea urchins that consume the seaweed, then very quickly the seaweed, which builds its house of sticks, overgrows the house of bricks. And that's what's happened. The seaweed has overgrown and smothered and killed the corals in a few years. So this diagram shows that idea rather abstractly. I've never tried to do it with the PowerPoint before, but I think I can walk you through it, and I'm just going to have to go away from the microphone. I'm sorry. So, in the beginning, before people came to the Caribbean, we had a situation where there were lots of fish, and perhaps fewer, but still lots of sea urchins. And because there were all these organisms that could graze on coral reefs and eat the seaweed, the relative abundance of the corals to the algae was very high. So we ate most of the fish, so the abundance of fish is decreasing from high to much less. But there were still some fish, and there were still lots of sea urchins, maybe even more sea urchins. And the sea urchins started doing the job of the fish, and they ate the seaweed. And so the ratio of abundance of the corals to the seaweed was still very high. But we kept eating fish, and then suddenly the sea urchins died of this amazing disease in 1983, which eliminated between 95% and 99% of the sea urchins in 1 year. And all of a sudden, there were no fish, there were no sea urchins, and in a few years, the ratio, the great abundance of corals to algae declined to this very low value of corals to algae. In other words, the system changed very, very quickly, but the cause of that change began way back hundreds of years ago when we started to fish in the environment. And that, it's basically the straw that broke the camel's back. You add the pile on and nothing happens. You add another pile on the back and nothing happens. You add another one, nothing happens. You add another one and the back breaks. And as you all know, it's sort of hard to fix the back. And this kind of nonlinear dynamics is characteristic of the failure of coastal ecosystems around the world. And it shows why it's not simple to put Humpty Dumpty back together again, because the thing has been set up over a very long period of time. Okay, so mass mortality of coral reefs. I've already gone through all this. If we want to fix coral reefs, we got to bring the fishes back. And if we don't bring the fishes back, we're not going to have the coral reefs, because we're going to have this problem of the seaweeds overgrowing them. Okay, so I've given you 3 stories, and in each of the stories, what we see is that as human expansion occurs and changes ecosystems in the ocean, the first thing that happens over and over and over again is fishing. And then we get these other consequences, other actions of pollution and habitat destruction and introduced species and climate change, all of which are important, and all of which are the things we pay the most attention to now because they're what we can see. And we forget about the magnitude of the changes that were caused by the fishing centuries ago in many cases. And when you hear debates and arguments about overfishing, and you see somebody will show you a graph, and they'll say, here's the control population, this is the way it used to be, and you look on that x-axis and you see that the data began in 1950, right? Remember that graph of the size of the codfish. It was already declining in 1950. Okay, so we can make a kind of general model of this kind of story. And it's not a very happy model. Again, I'm going to have to walk over. I'm sorry. So if we think about the coastal oceans from some time in the past when big human populations came in and started to exploit them, till now, and we had, in the beginning, this great abundance of large animals. And the first things that we affect are the large animals. My father was in the Navy in the Second World War. He was the commander of 12 LSTs, and he said they used to call them large slow targets. And turtles and whales and all those other things are basically large slow targets. And so at some time in the past, we fished those things out with extraordinary efficiency, like the green turtles, but there are dozens of examples. And not much happened. The structural organisms, corals, kelps and kelp forests, seagrasses and seagrass beds, the organisms that make the three-dimensional habitat, the equivalent of the forest in the ocean, they seem fine. But you have to remember that graph of the lag in effects. And then all of a sudden, they crash. And just about the time that this living habitat structure, the coral reefs and whatever are crashing, we get the real increase in microbial population. And this story is happening over and over again. And if you know any paleontology, you actually realize that as we move along in time here, we're going back into the Precambrian, because in places like Chesapeake Bay, what we have are microbes, slime, and jellyfish. And that's exactly like 650 million years ago. Okay. So why should we care? I mean, this isn't an aquarium, and you're all here, I think, because you care about the oceans to some degree or a lot. But what? It's sort of hard to hug a fish, and people just don't really have any idea of all this stuff that's happening. I mean, have you ever seen any of these places? It's very hard to get to them. We couldn't even go scuba diving until something like 50 or 60 years ago. Well, I want to give you this. This is I think you can see it well enough. That's Harvard Forest in a painting, and the reason I've got it there is because I want you to think about what happens when we cut down a forest. When we cut down a forest, we reverse succession. And we go from an ecosystem of very high diversity to one of very low diversity. We go from an ecosystem with great three-dimensional complexity and structure to an ecosystem which is essentially two-dimensional. And we plant our corn and our wheat and our rice. And obviously the reason we do that is because of the desirability of the crops we raise. Well, we can think about that process as a simple graph. The successional state, the three-dimensionality and the diversity declines over time as we cut down the forest or as we fish. And the productivity at the same time increases. It's that increase in productivity which is responsible for the only number that makes any difference in ecology. 6 times 10 to the 9th, that's 6 billion people. Those people exist because of that graph, the relationship of productivity to succession and the conversion of land to systems in which we can harvest maximal productivity. Okay, well, you say that's good, and you know, it feeds people, and we're never going to change that, and that's true, we're not. But what happens in the oceans? In the oceans, we decrease the successional state, and we increase the productivity, but what do we get? We don't get rice, we don't get corn, we don't get wheat, we get toxic dinoflagellate blooms. We get jellyfish, we get pfisteria, we get cholera. It's really going to be hard to market jellyfish and toxic dinoflagellate burgers. So whether you care about fish or not, and you just think solely in terms of human well-being, this story of what's happening in the coastal oceans is bad news. And so we need to figure out how to reverse this process, not only because hopefully you care about the fish and the corals and what have you, but also because of us, because of the fact that we rely on the oceans as a resource for food and protein and all sorts of good stuff. And when an ecosystem, when the straw breaks the camel's back in an estuary and there's nothing left but toxic dinoflagellates and jellyfish, we've lost that system. The dead zone off the Mississippi River is the size of New Jersey. The dead zone in the northern Adriatic is most of the northern Adriatic. The dead zone in big parts of the Baltic is on the size of, say, Rhode Island. These are not imaginary phenomena that are happening, and the consequence of these changes is what you see in this graph. Okay, and so the challenge is, how do we go back? And I'm not a romantic. I don't want to go back to so many big white sharks that they'd eat me when I'm going to do my research anyway. But somewhere along that way, somewhere back where the productivity decreases and some structure is attained, and we can have something like oysters that we can eat, is where we want to be, and that's one of our great challenges. Okay, so what I've said is that history runs deep in everything, and so I think that it's pretty obvious that if we're going to do things like fish, which we are going to do, then we ought to have some kind of serious environmental assessment of the impact of that fishing, not just on that species of fish, but on the entire ecosystem that that fish lives in, because big fish eat little fish, and there's no objective way of doing that without having a case history of the ecosystem, just the way the doctor looks at your case history if the doctor is competent. Case histories help to clarify underlying causes of ecological change due to people, and they demonstrate what's possible. Who would ever believe that there were 45 million 500-pound turtles? And I'll tell you, green turtle tastes good. I know you're not supposed to say that, but it's delicious. Okay. The third point is that environmental assessments can be really cheap and fast. Case histories can be done in the library. I'm not asking for a lot of money for scientists to go off and do the same old thing. As an example, this woman, Heike Lotze, did this study of 200 years of ecosystem change in an extremely important part of the Bay of Fundy in 6 months for $25,000. She went to the library. It's the first objective compilation of ecological and fisheries information for that region that's ever been done. We don't have such a document for the Chesapeake Bay. Okay, and then the final point is that if we decide to do something based on this information, we should do it with some clear sense of prediction so that we know whether or not we've succeeded or whether or not we've failed. Paul Collinville wrote this book a long time ago, Why Big Fierce Animals Are Rare, and it was the best popular book introducing ideas of ecology to the public that I know of for something like 20 years. And in that book, Paul explained why big fierce animals are rare in the usual scientific way of ecological efficiency and the second law of thermodynamics and food levels in the food chain and all the rest of it. But I have a much simpler explanation. Big fierce animals are rare because we ate them, or because we killed them because they ate what we wanted to have. And this is a beautiful example of how even straight fundamental science can get it all wrong, because scientists suffer from the shifting baseline syndrome just as much as anybody else. I always wondered as a paleontologist, how come the fossil record told us that there was this enormous abundance of big animals that we never saw in the world today? And now I have the answer. We ate them. I think that big animals are the ozone hole of the oceans. I think that where big animals disappear, all else is going to follow. I think that we need to worry about the big animals just as much as the little ones, and we have to pay attention to the entire ecosystem in the kind of way that I've been saying, and we better start to do it fast, because if we don't, you're going to tell your children a postmodern fish story. You're going to tell them about the ocean that got away, and you're going to show them the surviving fish in the New England Aquarium. Thank you very much.
Take a minute to turn this off and set up the video for 7 minutes, and then we will open up for questions.
Okay, so I made this movie with this wonderful guy named Randy Olson, who got his PhD next door at Harvard a while back, and was a tenured professor of marine biology at the University of New Hampshire, and threw it all in to go to film school. And it's been an absolutely fascinating collaboration to work with somebody who believes that he can do more about the kinds of issues I've just been talking about by making films than he could by teaching in the classroom. I don't know if he was right or not, but I'm sure glad he did what he did, because it's been a lot of fun. I started to do this stuff I just told you about because every ecosystem I ever studied in my 30-year career as a scientist is unrecognizably different from the way it looked when I studied it. The Chesapeake Bay, where I did my master's thesis, and all the rest of it. Here it is. Many of our coastal ecosystems have collapsed. To understand why, we need to know the history of these environments. To help you see this, let me give you an analogy. A woman with a rare disease is away on travel. She collapses and is rushed to the hospital, but the doctors know nothing of her past. Without her medical history, there is a risk of an incorrect diagnosis. In the same way, without knowing an environment's history, we can easily misdiagnose the cause of its problems. Take, for example, the Chesapeake Bay, a severely degraded coastal ecosystem. For the past few decades, we believed the problem was pollution and excess nutrient input. Steps have been taken to reduce these, but the bay has not rebounded as hoped. Now many scientists believe we have neglected its history. Chesapeake Bay used to be packed with oysters, which are vigorous filter feeders. It is estimated the entire volume of the bay used to be filtered through these animals in only 3 days. Imagine what would happen if such a biological filter were removed. Thus, it is not surprising that the major environmental problems for the bay began a century ago, when the oysters were rapidly fished out. The point is, the problems of today's coastal ecosystems are not only the result of today's activities. Just like diagnosing a patient, we need to determine the history of our oceans and include it in our assessment of current problems. Only then can we properly resolve the problems that now exist. The following segments present summaries of 3 case studies showing the importance of historical perspective. They are divided into 3 parts. First, a statement of the problem. Second, what we feel was the initial diagnosis. And third, the current re-diagnosis.
Stellar sea lions in the North Pacific have declined by over 90%. Previously, scientists have attributed this to starvation, suggesting that commercial fishing of halibut, pollock, and cod removed the sea lion's major source of food. But many have wondered why no one has reported seeing emaciated sea lions. There is now reason to suspect sea lions have disappeared because of predation. Killer whales used to feed primarily on great whales, which were overharvested 50 years ago. Now we think killer whales have switched to feeding on sea lions. The lush kelp beds of New England have drastically declined, often replaced by seemingly empty regions known as sea urchin barrens. The urchins are the culprits. They eat the kelp, but what allowed the urchins to increase in number? It was thought that lobsters were the predators holding urchins in check. Recent overfishing of lobsters allowed urchins to increase. But lobsters are, in fact, still very abundant in spite of fishing. What matters is what's not present. Of much greater importance are cod and other predatory fish which feed on urchins. They were once very abundant and grew to impressive size, but over the past 300 years, cod have been heavily overfished. Today, there are not enough of them, and they are removed at such a small size they can no longer keep urchin populations in check. The vast turtlegrass beds of Florida Bay have grown unhealthy. The blades are heavily fouled with algae and invertebrates. Entire beds have been wiped out by disease that infects the tips of the blades. Why are they so unhealthy? Pollution and excess nutrient input from coastal development have been the obvious explanations. But no one has considered the animals that once grazed on turtlegrass. What needs to be appreciated is how things used to be. Columbus reported seeing thousands of sea turtles in a single day, whereas today, you could spend a year in the Caribbean and not see a single turtle. Turtles fed on turtle grass. They were once living lawnmowers that closely cropped the blades. Now the turtles are gone. The lawn is no longer being mowed and is vulnerable to disease.
We all want to restore the quality of coastal ecosystems, and it is possible. The oceans are different from the land. Very few species in the ocean have gone extinct. Almost everything that was there in the beginning is still out there today, just less abundant and smaller in size. So there is hope. But to fix these coastal ecosystems, we have to know what we did to change them. We have to know, in essence, their medical history. If we can figure out what we did to the oceans, then we can begin to restore them to their previous richness and beauty.
I got cut off by it coming on. I just wanted to say that I think we have a real problem with the kind of films that we make. We make films for ourselves. We make really beautiful films for public television and for educational programs and all the rest of it. And they do an enormous amount of good, but they preach to the choir. And although this little film you just saw is we did that for $25,000. It was an experiment. But I really believe that we have to make films for the real people out there, for everybody out there. If we can't reach the entire public, then we really are just having a mutual admiration society telling ourselves what we already know. And I consider that to be the greatest challenge, really, in filmmaking for environmental issues, is to stop being beautiful and being drugged on nature and actually deal with the intellectual problems that we're facing in a way that everybody can understand. Okay.
I want to thank Jeremy again for his sobering and thoughtful talk and video, as well as the Lowell Institute for sponsoring this program. We're going to open up to questions with Jeremy picking the questioners. To enable WGBH to record this part of the session, please use the handheld mic. After the question and answer period, we'll have light refreshments outside where you can personally meet Jeremy or chat with yourselves. So, Jeremy. Okay. The mic's right here, so whoever wants to ask questions, just raise your hand and we'll pass the mic there. Do that.
I like your talk, but you commented that in some year the sea urchins vanished suddenly due to a disease. You said the population dropped 85%, something like that. Diseases are everywhere. Epidemics happen not only among us, but in the animal kingdom, and it's not all our fault. This may be a side point to your thesis.
No, it's actually just something I glossed over because of lack of time. I mean, disease, the frequency of marine disease appears to be increasing greatly. Of course, there are not many coral veterinarians, so the information tends to be rather anecdotal. There's some reason to believe that increase in disease is related to rising temperatures in some cases. And of course, disease, the likelihood of the outbreak of epidemic disease goes up with the population density, and very possibly these sea urchins had reached such high densities that they were more prone to infection. But even in the case of disease, I think there's a very clear historical component that if we don't pay attention to it, we'll miss it. The turtle grass wasting disease is one example, and even in the case of coral disease, it's an open question as to whether or not these mass mortalities that occur now are due to new disease vectors which have suddenly appeared on the scene, or what is far more likely, just as in human epidemic disease, that something has weakened the resistance of the corals and other organisms to the disease vectors. So the whole big question of the importance of disease in the oceans is one that needs an historical component as well. Well, and then
just a brief comment. I thought the video was terrific, but if the sound accompaniment could be reduced a little bit in volume, I think it would be much easier to understand the words.
Okay.
The whole thing is very good.
I'll have to tell that to the composer of the music, the sound engineer, yes.
Thank you very much. My question relates to a recent report that was issued by the Pew Oceans Commission, and it sort of focused on compilation of information that indicates that for mainly freshwater systems, and it doesn't extrapolate directly to marine, but you can draw the links as you have in your talk, and the focus of the report talks about when we have a situation where we have greater than 10% impervious surface in watersheds, there is a follow-on feature that happens in the ecosystem where it is a significant impact to the watershed. I wonder if you have looked at sort of the coastal impacts as well as the marine of the situation where we have such developed watersheds and facing the huge influx of population to the coast in the next 20 to 50 years, if you've focused at all on things like the impervious surfaces and the changing land patterns, the way you talked about the loss of forest.
When this work was done by a group of 20 people at the National Center for Ecological Analysis and Synthesis, which is basically an ecology think tank, and when we started the project, we intended to look at historical factors of all types. And we were so overwhelmed by the pattern of fishing coming first and having been forgotten that we decided midstream to focus entirely on fishing. It's pretty obvious that the dead zone in the Gulf of Mexico is mostly a result of what comes down that river. And it's pretty clear that there are big effects of changing drainage patterns to the oceans. I mean, I guess one can't focus on everything, and I feel so very strongly that if we don't understand the changes that we made before we started to do this new stuff, then we're never going to be able to put it back together again. But it's clearly a very big problem, and it's going to get worse. And as sea level rises, it's going to be really interesting because there's not going to be anywhere for salt marshes, for example, to migrate to with houses in front of them. But yeah. And then we can go over there.
Would you comment on how hard, you mentioned that there's still hope and that there may be a 10-year window. Would you comment on each of these problems and what the obstacles are, how hard it really is, how hard it would be to bring the turtles back, how hard it would be to bring the codfish back or back to size, and how hard?
That's a great question. So let's start in the sequence I did the talk. The oysters. You know, one of the fascinating things about our paper and all the attention it got, and it got incredible attention. There were more than 200 newspaper articles about that paper, and it's just, is that all of the information we talked about was in the literature. We did no new research for that paper. All we did was read carefully and think about it. And as far back as the 1970s, people were saying that without the oysters, the Chesapeake Bay could not recover and would only get worse. And it's really interesting because basically nobody has tried. There have been experiments done by a fellow named Pete Peterson and his student Hunter Lenahan, who really did the work, demonstrating that it's possible for oyster populations to live in the environments everybody says they cannot live in, and that they can resist the disease if, no great surprise, they're lifted off the bottom so they have some oxygen, and etc. So how do you do something on that kind of scale? Well, I don't know. I guess have 1,000 barges full of oysters and bring them in and don't let them sink, keep them floating, and see if you can clean up one sub-estuary like the James River. It would cost so much less to do that experiment than what we spend now, with no, and you know, that's a 10-year experiment, and you'd know. For the turtles are a problem because turtles don't even reproduce until they're 30, 35 years old, we now think. But there are a lot of turtles out there. And your question, as soon as you move to turtles, you know, farming oysters is not controversial. Farming or ranching turtles is very controversial. And aquaculture done in a kind of dumb and irresponsible way is a catastrophe. But I believe that we're just going to have to face up to the fact that we need to help some of these species along and need to look at it. And it certainly couldn't be a bad thing to try to do everything possible to protect green turtles in some kind of controlled environmental way. I think one would get results again in about a decade. And then the third example, the coral reefs, is really the simplest and in a way the most pathetic. The entire fish catch in Jamaica is worth almost nothing in developed country terms. The average size fish caught in the traps is a few inches long. The fish are used to make something called fish tea. You just throw the whole fish in and you get some of the nutrient value. Surely it should be possible to do an experiment to protect the fish populations on the scale of half of Jamaica and do it in very economical and responsible terms for the local people. And we don't really do it that way. Marine protected areas are a very, very important prospect on the horizon, and I believe in them totally. But I sometimes think we're not entirely realistic about the scale that they need to be practiced on and the amount of time that will be necessary to see results.
ask if I thought you made a great point about including media and making it more applicable to the general public so that we're not preaching to the choir. And obviously a big part of the general public are the fishermen. And I was wondering if you or anyone in the audience could speak to initiatives that are planning to bring the voices of fishermen in a participatory way. And part of that might be, too, is using them to collect baseline data as far as talking to fishermen and generations of fishermen on what they know, just sort of not necessarily quantities, but just stories that indicate how the fishing was.
Well, I'll take a crack first, and you know, I have a great deal of respect for local knowledge, and I lived in Panama for 13 years and worked as a geologist there, and I learned very quickly that the people who lived in the countryside knew a lot more about what was there than I did. But I think I think a central point of my talk is that the old story that you should have seen the way they used to be is so much more true than anybody realizes. And I don't know if you saw the film Empty Oceans, Empty Nets, but it's really interesting. You get these wonderful contradictory statements by people who are in the fishing business. People who say, well, we blew it. We knew we were taking them and we took them and now we're paying for it. And people who say, oh, no, there's lots of fish out there. But I would argue that as important as that perspective is, if we don't realize that what we have been looking at, studying, and harvesting over the last 20, 25 years is such a small fraction of what used to be there, then we're never going to get anywhere. And the people who are out there doing it today, they don't know that because they didn't see it. And you know, think about that cod graph, right? And think about passenger pigeons and the people in this part of the world. They were living at the time of the extinction of the passenger pigeon. They were living at the time of that vertical drop at the end of the graph and the average size of the cod being eaten. And those people, they could see it around them, but it never really registered, you know, and there was no sense of the abundance. And I think the same problem exists in fishing. So while I think that many times people who fish know a lot more about fish than the people who are regulating fishing, I think no scientists today who do not take the trouble to become historically informed has the beginnings of an idea of what the basis of the resource was. And think about the fact that we have laws that say that if we reduce by fishing the abundance of species X, Y, or Z to some number, like 20% of its original abundance, then we must stop. Well, the original abundance is defined as 1950 or 1960 or 1970. But from the kinds of things I've been talking about, it's obvious that by the time that we call original abundance, in most cases, the population sizes were already greatly reduced. So I don't think any one group can be allowed to have the information. I think all the information needs to be there. But I strongly believe in this case study approach. I mean, having had my own brush with serious illness, it's very gratifying to see half a dozen specialists get together and talk about what's wrong with you and try and figure out how to fix you. We don't do that in the oceans. We don't take advantage of that basic case history data. And that is something that all of us who are alive today are going to have to inform ourselves from the past. Nobody who's out there now knows that. One more?
Thank you. This kind of ties into the last question about the fishermen, and I live in a fishing community. A lot of what I hear is that the United States has a lot of regulations that other countries don't have, and so the fishermen don't feel that it's fair, when in fact what the other countries are doing is also affecting more local populations. And so my question is there an international committee, or do you foresee one to deal with some of the problems that you have with overfishing?
You know, I don't know if you've ever heard Daniel Pauly's talk, you know, where he shows you the map of fishing catch in the North Atlantic over 100 years, and it goes from, and hot colors are abundant and cold colors are rare, and it goes from hot colors all over the North Atlantic to little blebs of cold colors. And then he shows the graph of effort, and it goes from, you know, limited effort in a few places to hot colors all over the ocean, because they're all out there saying, how are we going to catch the last fish? We got a long way to go before we achieve that international control. But I don't, you know, if I were in the slide rule business, it would have been really tough to have calculators come along, and I'd have to go out and figure out something else to do. I think that the way we've used the oceans, the way we've fished, and the magnitude of fish we've taken out is going to have to stop, or there's not going to be any fish. And I don't think it's really an issue of fairness per se. I think it's an issue of the management of the resource. It's true that there's an enormous amount of hypocrisy in the world, and it's true that a lot of the fish you eat, if you go across the street to that restaurant, comes from another place where they don't have those rules and regulations. But does that have anything to say about whether or not you care about the fish in your national waters being protected? Or do you want to go out and style like everybody else? So, I mean, I just don't think it's an important question, but it's a different question. The question about what should be done to help people who are in a business that needs to be controlled in extreme ways compared to the way it was in the past, that's a very important human issue. But the scientific question and the management question about whether or not the entire coast of the United States is going to be like the Chesapeake Bay and smell of rotten eggs and be dangerous to your health or not, that's an important question too. And if some people have to change the way they make a living to achieve that, then I guess they're going to have to change the way they make their living. I really meant what I said about the bottleneck. The problem is everywhere. I mean, talk to people who make beautiful nature movies. They got to go farther and farther away to find that one beautiful sequence to film, because you can't go out there to all those places where they used to be and film it. That's why you see the same footage over and over again, because you can count on the fingers of one hand the number of really cool shots of a bluefin tuna or a swordfish. So this is a universal ocean problem, and virtually everywhere you go, the same thing happens. And we, all of us who live in this fortunate society, we are not aware of the magnitude, because we go to our fish market or the restaurant and we buy fish which is still pretty abundant, and from our point of view of affluence is still cheap. But it didn't come from here, because it's almost all gone from here, and at the rate we're removing it from those other places, it won't be in those places either in 5 or 10 or 20 years. So, yes, it's an enormous problem. It affects the entire global ocean. And whether or not people are going to wake up to it or not, I have no idea. But it's, I saw these changes in my lifetime. You're a much younger person. The kinds of changes you're going to see are going to be a lot more distasteful than the changes I saw.
Thank you once again. Please join us for refreshments outside.